Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing 5 Sharks topics that didn't quite deserve their own video, but that I still wanted to talk about because I find them to be pretty important as we head into the 25-26 season. Usually when I make a video, I want them to be at around the 10-minute mark at a minimum, but usually closer to about 15 to 20 minutes, and yet there are certain Sharks topics that, while interesting, don't really have enough to them to actually get to that length. And so the purpose of this video is to just be a rapid fire of Sharks topics, talking about each one after the other. And we start off at the top of that list with Sharks goaltender Yaroslav Askarov. I honestly haven't talked much about the Sharks goaltending throughout this offseason. The major question coming into it was who would make up the rest of that tandem in the NHL to play with Askarov, and the Sharks answered this rather early on when they acquired Alex Nedeljkovic from the Pittsburgh Penguins. Otherwise, I have been focused on the forward lines and the defensive pairings, but the goaltending for San Jose is going to be exceptionally important as we head into this next year, and we have seen the type of difference that a good goaltender can make for the performance of a team. We really only have to look at the Sharks this past season when they started the year with Mackenzie Blackwood. Yes, they did lose those first 9 games of the season. That's not something that is easy to ignore, but in the following 22 game stretch, the Sharks were actually an above 500 team, and a large reason for this was because Blackwood was doing a great job of not only keeping them in games, but actually winning them some that they probably didn't deserve. And yet that 22 game stretch came to an end when the Sharks traded Blackwood to the Colorado Avalanche in exchange for Alexander Georgiev, going from one of the better starters in the league to one of, if not the worst, starters in the league. And the effect was felt immediately. The Sharks season completely tanked from there, not only because Georgiev, as I said, was just a worse goaltender, and so he's letting in more goals, but that also bleeds in to the rest of your team. When you have a good goaltender between the pipes, the players in front can feel confident in going out and playing more freely and trying to make plays, because if they make a mistake, they know their goalie has the chance to back them up. But when you play in front of a weaker one, like Georgiev was this past season, well, you're going to play a lot more reserved, because you're going to feel as though that any type of error that you make ends up in the back of your net. And as the saying goes, the best defense is a good offense. You really want to be pushing the pace here in the NHL to actually win more games than not. And yet, because the Sharks were kind of playing this more reserve style and still giving up a bunch of goals because Georgiev was not doing a particularly good job, it was basically the turning point of the San Jose Sharks season. It was just completely downhill from there. Now, I'm not saying that Askarov necessarily needs to be as good as Blackwood was this past season, but that he does need to be better than what Georgiev was. Get to a level that the team in front of him can have faith in him to actually come up with some big saves. And we have seen some really good outings from Askarov this past season. He played a few games in the NHL, not a ton, but enough to get a glimpse of what he is capable of. And the one game that I always go back to is that performance against the Edmonton Oilers, a really good team, especially from an offensive perspective. And Askarov was pretty much single-handedly keeping the San Jose Sharks alive in that one. And while they would ultimately end up losing that game in overtime, Askarov was far and away the Sharks' best player in that one. And yet in certain other outings, we saw some weaker goals being let in, some lapses of focus from Yaroslav Askarov that led to some pretty weak goals against for San Jose. And so, going into what will end up being his first full season as an NHL starter-ish, I guess you could say, depending on how much of the split goes between him and Nedeljkovic, but he'll certainly be kind of like a 1A type of situation. Going into his first season in that type of spot, it's going to be about playing more so consistently on that Edmonton Oilers side and not so much onto those weaker goals that can sometimes sneak through. This is really going to be a big difference maker for the San Jose Sharks this next year. How good is their goaltending? Is it going to be enough to try and carry them out of the cellar that they have finished in each of these past 2 seasons? This is also a really good opportunity for Askarov to kind of really put his money where his mouth is. It was last off-season where he had basically demanded a trade from the Nashville Predators because he didn't want to stay there for multiple years as the backup to Juuse Saros, who they had just signed to a very significant contract extension. He wanted to be a starter, get that opportunity in the NHL, and the Sharks, they're willing to provide it to him, and it is the moment for him to show that he is truly capable of taking on that role. And this isn't just about the short term. This isn't just about doing well this season, but you're really looking ahead into the long term as well. This is a goaltender who the Sharks are hoping can be their franchise guy, that he is still going to be here in 3 years, in 5 years, maybe even in 10 years, that he is going to be the goaltender who helps bring the Stanley Cup to San Jose for the first time, and it does start with this rookie season. Not to say that it's going to be the end-all be-all for Askarov, but you're hoping for a solid performance to get him started on the right foot. Next player to talk about here is Sam Dickinson. Now, I have mentioned Dickinson a few times this offseason, of course, because he is a very interesting player to talk about, just because he will likely be playing the majority, if not the entirety, of the season in the NHL this next year, and he is the top defensive prospect that they do have. And I've mentioned him in terms of defensive pairings, where he'll end up playing probably on a third pairing with a guy like Nick Leddy, or maybe Vinny DeHarnay, or maybe Timothy Liljegren. But I'm going to be taking a little bit of a different approach for this particular video, not discussing where he plans on fitting in for the Sharks team, but instead almost kind of like a word of warning when it comes to Dickinson, really just to try and kind of temper expectations around him. Us Sharks fans were incredibly spoiled this past season when it came to the performance of Macklin Celebrini, who as an 18-year-old was able to come into the NHL and literally from the first game that he played be just absolutely fantastic, and then was able to carry that through for the entirety of his NHL season. This is not a very replicable situation for most young teenage players coming into the NHL for the first time. It is much more realistic to see something like from Will Smith this past year, where there is that slow adjustment to this really tough game and much faster game in the NHL that they have ever actually played before. We saw Smith the first couple of months maybe not do all that well, and this is likely where Sam Dickinson will end up falling instead. Obviously, I hope that he's able to come in here and hit the ground running and become a strong power play and penalty kill guy right out of the gate for the Sharks, put up some big numbers, play in their top 4, and end up as like a Calder finalist by the end of this season. It is certainly possible that that does occur, but the more realistic scenario is that this is going to be a player who will have his bumps in the road, who will have these struggles in a year that is going to essentially be a development year for him. If the Sharks actually had, an optimal situation here, Dickinson probably wouldn't even be in the NHL in the first place. He would be playing with the San Jose Barracuda in the AHL, but because of that NHL-CHL agreement, that is not possible, and the best of a kind of bad situation here is to have him play at that top league, but it is not an easy thing to do for a young defenseman. Dickinson had a ton of success this past season with the London Knights. He was incredible for them in the regular season and the playoffs and the Memorial Cup. He was named the CHL's best defenseman of the year, but there are still weaknesses in his game. Issues with his defensive zone decision-making, his decisions-making with the puck, and those were able to be compensated for with just raw talent and size and skating ability at that CHL level. But when it comes to the NHL, against the best of the best in the world, there are definitely going to be goals against that are on Dickinson, that are his fault. There are going to be games where he will struggle. There will be games that are just not going to look particularly good, and yet that needs to be just a very acceptable situation here because of just how difficult of a spot he is being put in, having to play in the NHL at this age of 19 as that young defenseman on a team that in the first place isn't particularly good. I always go back to the original performance from Joe Thornton in his rookie season. We know the type of player that he ended up becoming, one of the best playmakers in NHL history. He put up huge numbers. His number is retired by the San Jose Sharks, and yet back in his rookie season, he had a grand total of 7 points in 55 games. Nobody at that time would have looked at him and viewed him as a first ballot Hall of Famer, and yet here we are. He is exactly that. That first season, it's sort of a getting used to the NHL, and that is where I expect Dickinson to truly end up being, just that slow acclimation to the NHL level. Again, hoping for the best from him, but trying to keep my expectations a little bit more level. One other thing that I think is important to kind of avoid as we head into this next season in the case with Sam Dickinson is getting into that comparing game, in particular with other young defensemen from his draft year, and in particular from that, defenseman Zeev Buium of the Minnesota Wild, who, of course, as we know, the Sharks could have drafted with that 11th overall pick. It is going to be very tempting to kind of view it as a grass is greener as on the other side type of situation, to see what Zeev Buium is doing with Minnesota, and if he does well, to say, the Sharks made the incorrect choice. But it's very important to keep patience with a player like Sam Dickinson. It is two entirely different situations. Buium is multiple months older. He played in the NCAA, which I would say is a step up from the CHL, so a little bit more better prepared for this jump to the NHL level. And Buium has even already played some NHL game, got into some postseason action with Minnesota this past season, and to be fair, didn't even look particularly good in that postseason action. But then on top of all of this, Buium is going to be put into a position to succeed with some top power play minutes, some big offensive zone time, something that probably won't be the case with Sam Dickinson. So again, very important to kind of just be focused in on what he is doing well. Try to not key in too much on what he is doing poorly, as that's something that will come with time, and just hope that he can have the best possible season that he can and not try to get too down on him. Next to talk about here, we have the Sharks' fourth line. I've obviously touched on this when I've discussed my forward line predictions as we head into this next season, talking about a few of those kind of replacement level players that the Sharks have near the bottom of their lineup. But I find this to be even more interesting because there are going to be some decisions here, some tough ones that Mike Grier is going to have to make. So there are two kind of scenarios that we have to think about. The first of which is a scenario where Michael Misa does not make it to the NHL, and the second, of course, is where he does. Now let's start off where he doesn't. That means that the San Jose Sharks will have a pretty much set in stone top 9, as I have mentioned in the past. This is including Colin Graff in that. There is always still the slight possibility that he ends up being sent down and starting the year with the San Jose Barracuda because he is waiver exempt, but I'm holding out hope that that mistake will not be made by Ryan Warsofsky and Mike Grier, so I suspect that he will be in that top 9, which leaves 3 open spots on the fourth line. And the Sharks, they've got 4 kind of NHL-ish players who can fill into those positions. Barclay Goodrow, Ty Dellandrea, Carl Grundstrom, and the newly acquired Ryan Reeves. It is likely that it'll end up being Barclay Goodrow as that fourth line center, flanked by Dellandrea and Grundstrom, and Reeves will be the 13th forward, which works out rather well because I suspect that the Sharks will sit with 8 defensemen up in the NHL, and Reeves will just get in and out of the lineup as Warsofsky sees fit. However, there is one player who does complicate this a little bit, and that is actually Zach Ostapchuk. I talked about him in my AHL video, but the Sharks acquired him from the Ottawa Senators in the Fabian Zetterlund trade, and they had him playing a lot in the NHL near the end of that season. And while I don't necessarily think he did exceptionally well to be fully deserving of an NHL spot, it is very possible that management disagrees with me, and it is also possible that management is just going to look to try and kind of save face a little bit. This was a player who the Sharks acquired in a trade for a fan favorite in Fabian Zetterlund, who was a capable player of putting up 20 plus goals, 40 plus points. You don't want to kind of abandon a guy like Ostapchuk already and have him be taking a step backwards going back to the AHL, even if he sort of deserves it. And so if he is put into a position on this NHL lineup, and to be fair, he is a better fourth line center option than Barclay Goodrow is, so just from a purely meritocratic perspective, this would be the correct choice, but that only leads now 2 open slots at your fourth line, and that would probably be Barclay Goodrow, because we know that the coaching staff has a very much infatuation with Goodrow, so he'll be a winger there, and then that leaves 1 open slot for one of Dellandrea, Grundstrom, or Reeves. Now I suspect while Reeves might not get like that key top 12 spot right from the get-go, he will stick around. I don't think the Sharks acquired him to immediately put him on waivers, which then, unless the Sharks run 14 forwards, which I don't think will happen, will leave one of Dellandrea or Grundstrom as the odd man out, a player to be put onto waivers. Personally, if I had to choose, I would hang on to Grundstrom. I find that he brings even more of a physical aspect. I believe he led the Sharks in hits per 60 minutes this past season, and there's also more offensive upside. It was far from being consistent, but at least Grundstrom showed some flashes of good play. We never really got that from Dellandrea this past season, so he would be the guy on the outside looking in. To me, he would be the guy to place onto waivers, and I think the Sharks should be willing to do that. They should not be trying to save and hang on to these types of players that really don't move the needle all that much in the positive sense, and honestly, if anything, they're moving it more so in the negative sense. The other scenario, however, is that if Michael Misa does make it to the NHL, this complicates things quite considerably, because obviously he will be a top 9 player. You want to probably keep Colin Graff there still, hopefully once more, and that would probably drop Adam Gaudette to the Sharks' fourth line, and if you still hang on to Ostapchuk in that fourth line center role as well, that leaves just one space open, probably still taken by Barclay Goodrow, and if Reeves is still your 13th forward, now you're probably having to waive both Dellandrea and Grundstrom. Again, not going to be shedding any tears here, but these are two players who the Sharks had play a considerable amount of games this past season. They are two players who the Sharks went out and not only acquired last year, not in free agency, but through trades. They gave up actual assets to get these two players. Grundstrom, not really a big one in Kyle Burroughs, but the Sharks did give up a draft pick for Ty Dellandrea to immediately drop them the following season. Again, it's not a bad choice, but it is kind of a poor look, I would say, but likely the correct move anyhow if indeed Misa makes it to the NHL. So some tough decisions here. I'm hopeful that the Sharks will come to the correct one, which is indeed waiving both of these players, but we'll see what happens. The next person who I want to talk about is actually the Sharks head coach, Ryan Warsofsky, who is coming off of his rookie season in the NHL, his first year as an NHL head coach, and he did an all-around pretty decent job. I made a video a few months ago reviewing his first season, and I came to the conclusion that it was at the very least a little bit above average, nothing spectacular, but at the very least pretty good. But the thing is that as we head into this next season, this is where the real challenge begins. Honestly, this past year was kind of like a trial run for him, where unless the Sharks were horrifically bad, like literally worse than the 23-24 season, his spot on this team as head coach was likely always going to be maintained, as it was kind of a growth year for the San Jose Sharks. But as we head into the 25-26 season, we do need to see some actual tangible improvements, and that's not just things like moral victories game after game. Oh, well, the Sharks lost a bunch of one-goal games here this season, so that's pretty good. There need to be some very real results being shown. An improvement of just 1 or 2 wins would very clearly, in my eyes, put Ryan Warsofsky on the hot seat. Now, I'm not saying that this team needs to be competing for a playoff spot this next season, pretty far from it, nor do they need to be like in a 90-point type of range, but this was a team that was very deep in the standings this last year. They were last place, and they were 9 points behind Chicago, who was the second last place team, and 16 points behind Nashville, who was third last. That is a significant gap behind two teams that are also going to be looking to improve going into this next season. So a few points here or there is not going to move the needle. The Sharks actually have to get closer to that 60s to perhaps even low 70s type of range, and that obviously needs a lot of other things to go well for San Jose, but it starts at the top with their head coach, who finally needs to get this team moving in a positive direction. Now, when it came to last year, it was kind of tough to really separate the kind of just general makeup of the team from Ryan Warsofsky. The roster was not the most skilled last season, so certain issues are not really on him, but there was one thing in particular that stood out in a major way, which is that the Sharks, they were the lowest scoring team in the entire NHL, and they didn't really seem to be helping themselves in that case. They had this unwillingness to actually get to the blue paint, to the crease area of the ice, where a lot of goals are actually scored in the NHL. And it's one thing if your 18-year-old rookie in Macklin Celebrini isn't doing that, or your 19-year-old rookie in Will Smith isn't doing that. But the Sharks had a lot of those type of grinder players who would naturally expect to be making their money in that area of the ice. Players like Cunnin, Sturm, Goodrow, Dellandrea, Grundstrom, these guys who really you would think would want to be in that area as much as possible. And yet, for whatever reason, this was not something that was done all that frequently. It is the reason for why the Sharks' bottom 6 was as low scoring as it was. A player like Dellandrea in over 70 games having just a singular goal, where if he just sort of positions himself in front of the net, just from the randomness that exists in a hockey game, you would think the puck would like deflect off of him a couple times during the course of an entire season, but he's not there nearly frequently enough. And that does feel like it kind of comes from the top. I obviously don't know the exact behind the scenes details to be able to say that clearly Warsofsky is petitioning against actually heading to the front of the net. But it was sort of strange to see that the Sharks just never quite did this on any sort of consistent basis. And the thing is, as we head into this next season, the Sharks didn't exactly acquire players to be able to do this better off. Sure, Gaudette might be someone who is willing to, but Kurashev and Skinner don't really scream net front presence type of guys. And so this is going to have to be a full team effort, not just fourth liners doing this, but even players like Celebrini, Smith, Eklund, Toffoli, these types of guys, if the Sharks truly want to make some progress here and actually digging themselves out from the lowest scoring team in the entire NHL. You cannot simply just rely on skill and shooting ability and passing ability to be able to create these beautiful looking goals, highlight reel type of plays. There need to be the ones that just happen to deflect off of you and head into the back of the net. I mentioned the Sharks losing so many one-goal games. Those are the types of goals that can make the difference in these types of nights. And Warsofsky has to be the one championing this type of move forward. Now, another thing for Ryan Warsofsky that's going to be very important is actually team chemistry, trying to get this team onto the same page. Because as we've gone over these past few seasons, the Sharks have been rebuilding. That much is known. And because of this, Mike Grier has done a lot of kind of patchwork to put together a roster that can at the very least dress night in, night out. And so there has been a significant amount of roster turnover with expiring contracts, 1 year, 2 year types of deals. But this is a season in which at the very least there is some stability, in particular when it comes to the Sharks' top six. They still have Celebrini, Smith, Eklund, Toffoli, but there are also a lot of new faces. Toffoli, Kurashev, Gaudette just at the forward side, but in particular on the blue line, with the additions of Orlov, Klingberg, and Nick Leddy, who are all entirely new to the organization. But even players like Mukhamadullin, who's only played a couple dozen games in the NHL, Vinny DeHarnay, who's only played a handful of games with the Sharks, this is a blue line that is a little bit scattered and that Ryan Warsofsky has to be able to bring together, and he needs to do this rather quickly, which actually ties into my final point, which is just written start here, which is a little bit vague, but the idea is that the Sharks need to get off to a good start this season, something that they have failed to do in each of the past 2 years. 2 seasons ago, the Sharks lost their first 11 games of the season. Last year, the Sharks lost their first 9 games, and that is simply something that cannot happen again. It would be exceptionally demoralizing for pretty much all parties involved. First, from a player perspective, to be losing once more that often to begin the year, it's just going to send the message to these players that it is once again a year that is going to be completely lost. You want to try and keep up the hope that this team can actually make the playoffs, even if it is exceptionally unlikely to do so, for as long as possible. You want to get to a point in January or February where the team is, maybe 8-9 points out of a playoff spot, but can at the very least still have that belief that if they do well, they can actually get to that point. But if you lose the first 10 games of the season and you're sitting there with like 1 or 2 points from a couple of overtime losses, and now the playoff teams are there at already 14 points, 15 points, or whatever the case may be, that is not a good situation for the players, and that's going to lead to lower levels of confidence, lower levels of play, and it ends up being this self-fulfilling prophecy where because the team has started poorly, the players are now going to play poorly, and it just snowballs from there. But it is not just from a player perspective, but also from a fan perspective as well. The Sharks have had struggles with attendance numbers in these past few seasons, and this is not a surprise whatsoever. It is a very big expenditure to be spending multiple hundreds of dollars to go see a team who has about a 75% chance of actually losing in each of these last few years, and a decent chance of that loss being exceptionally embarrassing. Games where the Sharks lose 10-1 or 8-1 or things of this nature. That is not really an exciting aspect to go to one of those games to see the Sharks just get absolutely pummeled. And if you once again start with 8 losses, 9, 10 losses in a row, you're going to send the message to the fans that it is just more of the same here, and a lot will honestly end up checking out and saying okay, I'll be back next year to see if things have changed. So for the Sharks, it is going to be exceptionally important for them to actually get off to at least a decent start. I'm not saying that they need to go 7-3, 8-2 or anything crazy like that where they need to be in a playoff position by the time Thanksgiving rolls around, but they need to be in a position at something like maybe 4-4-2, around a 500 record, maybe slightly below that, 3-6-1 or something along those lines, where there are some actual wins here to get somewhat excited about to keep morale up on this team. And again, this will be about Warsofsky trying to get everybody kind of onto the same page as quickly as possible, just leaving this to happen as time goes on, thinking, okay, but by January or February, I'm sure the team will have some chemistry between each other. That's not something that needs to be the case. These players really have to be on that same wavelength early on, because this is not a Sharks team that can just allow themselves to slack off. When it comes to a team like Vegas or Florida, they could have one or two issues on the roster. Maybe their penalty kill isn't doing particularly well. Maybe their goaltending is having some issues here or there. But because the floor is so high for them, they'll likely end up making the postseason anyway. But for San Jose to get where they want to be, which as I said is probably in that kind of 65, maybe 70 point range, they need to be firing on all cylinders. And it starts at the top with Ryan Warsofsky, and if he's incapable of doing that, the Sharks might end up having to look elsewhere. So that is going to be very pivotal for San Jose. But that will do it for this video. As I said, 5 topics that I do think are pretty important, but maybe wouldn't have gotten like 15 minutes to discuss here, but still I thought very interesting. Class dismissed.